Assalamu alaikum, everyone, and welcome back to the BeQuran Podcast. I'm Ali.
And I'm Fatima. And today we're diving deep into one of the most foundational concepts in Islam, Tawheed, the oneness of God. But not just in the general sense, we're talking about the deeper distinctions. Wahid versus Ahad. Two Arabic words that both mean one, but carry very different meanings when it comes to how we understand Allah's nature.
Exactly. We'll explore why the idea of God having no parts is so essential, how it relates to his self-sufficiency, and what that means when we talk about creation and sustenance. We'll also take a look at examples from the Quran, like the story of Prophet Isa and the bird made from clay, and a fascinating hadith involving Imam Mahdi.
So if you've ever wondered what it really means when we say Allah is one, this episode is for you. Let's get into it. Bismillah.
The source we're exploring today is a lecture by Sayed Mohammed Baqer al-Qazwini. It's titled, "What's the Difference Between Al-Wahid and Al-Ahad?"
Right, so our mission today is really to unpack the ideas in this lecture. Like, what happens when you examine these seemingly small differences in words? How do they actually point to really fundamental beliefs about God's nature?
Right.
We'll get into this key difference between two Arabic words for one, wahid and ahad. And it honestly leads to a fascinating philosophical argument. And there's also a specific take on creation and sustenance, how that relates to God's power, and might not be what you expect. It's definitely got some more. Okay, let's unpack this. So the source starts with Tawheed, naturally, but immediately zooms in on these two words, Wahid and Ahad. They both mean one, roughly.
But the source insists they're absolutely not the same thing. There's a crucial difference. Okay, so what's the difference it's making? Let's start with Wahid.
Right. Wahid, according to this text, is about numerical oneness.
Simple as that. Meaning
There's one God, not two, not three, not a pantheon. It's about singularity in number, just one.
Okay, that feels pretty straightforward, like counting one item. But then there's Ahad. How does the source define that one? Because it says it's different.
Very different. Ahad, as the source explains it, means one whole, but the critical part is indivisible. It means this one has absolutely no parts, zero composition.
Okay. So Wahid is quantity, how many guys. Ahad is more about the quality or the internal structure.
Or lack thereof.
Exactly that. It's about the essence. The source argues that saying Allah is Ahad means he's the single, unique essence that simply cannot be broken down, cannot be divided, has no components. And that definition, that idea of Ahad having no parts, leads the source to a big conclusion pretty quickly, doesn't it?
About God having a body. Yeah, that's a direct consequence drawn in the text. If something has a body, it's made of parts. Organs, limbs, cells, anything physical occupies space, exists in time. It's inherently composite, made of things.
So if Allah is Ahad, fundamentally without parts, then he can't have a physical body, can't be contained in the physical world.
That's the interpretation presented, because being ahad in this specific sense means being utterly beyond composition, which includes physical composition.
Which, leads to the next question the source tackles. Why does it matter so much? Why this insistence on having no parts?
Gives a couple of reasons. The first one feels quite intuitive.
Needing parts implies dependency.
Yes, that's the first layer. If something is made of parts, it depends on those parts, right? For its existence, its function, its completeness, like a car needs its engine.
Right, exactly. So if God were made of parts, he would depend on those parts. But a core concept here is that Allah is absolutely self-sufficient, ghani, needs nothing. So dependency on parts would contradict that fundamental self-sufficiency.
Makes sense. But the second reason the source gives is where it gets, well, really philosophical. It argues that if God did have a part, that part wouldn't just be a piece of God. It would, philosophically speaking, have to be God itself.
Right. This is where it brings in that philosophical argument about parts and wholes, and it uses an analogy to make the point clearer.
The table analogy. Yeah, I remember that.
Yes, a table has parts, legs, a top surface. The source asks, which comes first, the parts or the whole table?
And the argument is that the parts have to come first, philosophically.
You need the legs, the wood, the screws, whatever.
Right. You mean the components. And then you assemble them, and then you have the whole table. The whole exists because of the parts coming together. Its existence depends on their prior existence.
Okay, following that logic for physical things like tables. Now, if you apply that same logic to God,
If God had parts, those parts would have to exist before God as a whole could exist.
precisely, and that's the devastating implication for the concept of God, according to this argument. I think it could.
Because if parts existed before God, it means something existed prior to God. And God, by definition in this view, is the ultimate necessary existence, the absolute first. Nothing can come before God.
Right. So if something else existed first to make up God's parts, then that prior thing would actually be the ultimate reality, the truly divine, not the God assembled from them. So saying God has parts forces you into this logical contradiction where something has to precede the one who, by definition, can't be preceded, the uncreated. That's the philosophical bind it creates, according to the source. It makes the concept incoherent. Therefore, defining Allah as Ahad, having no parts, is seen as essential to preserving his fundamental nature as the necessary uncreated origin.
Wow, okay. So that distinction, Wahid for numerical oneness, Ahad for essential, indivisible oneness. It's not just semantics, it's foundational.
Absolutely. It underpins the whole understanding of God's unique essence and avoids these philosophical pitfalls. That's the first major takeaway from this section of the source. One God, numerically, Wahid, and that one God is an indivisible essence, Ahad.
Okay, then the source kind of shifts gears a bit. Still under the umbrella of Tawheed, but looking at other aspects mentioned in the Quran, specifically Tawheed of khalq, creation, and Tawheed of rizq, sustenance.
Yes, and it states the standard understanding, only Allah creates, only Allah sustains, khaliq and raziq. But it dives into this because it acknowledges that apparently there have been questions or maybe even disagreements among some believers about whether certain figures, like certain imams, might also create or provide rizq.
Exactly. It addresses this potential point of confusion head-on. And it uses a specific historical example, right? A query sent to Imam Mahdi during the minor occultation.
That's right. A query asking for clarification. Can the imams create? Can they give rizq?
And the answer, according to the hadith cited in the source, the answer reporter was very clear. Allah alone is the creator and sustainer, raziq. However...
Oh, there's a however.
Yes. The response added that the Ahlul Bayt, the Prophet's family, including the Imams in this context, they ask Allah to create or sustain, and Allah responds to their requests, to their prayers.
Okay, that's a really important distinction. It's not saying they have their own independent power alongside Allah.
No, it's saying they're the memes, maybe, the channel. Allah acts through them or in response to them.
Right. They're intermediaries in that sense.
That's the framework presented. And the source brings up another example from the Quran itself to illustrate this point further. Prophet Jesus creating a bird from clay.
Because the verse on the surface quotes Jesus saying, "I create for you from clay the shape of a bird."
Which sounds very much like Jesus is doing the creating.
It does sound that way initially. But the interpretation offered by the source, presented as the correct one, is that yes, Jesus performed the physical act with the clay, shaped it, he did the action we see, but it was Allah who actually infused it with life, blew the spirit into it, made it a living creature.
Jesus was the, let's say, the visible conduit for the miracle.
The instrument.
The instrument, exactly. But the ultimate authorship of the life, the existence of that bird, belongs solely to Allah. So even when it looks like a prophet is performing an act of creation, the underlying reality from this perspective is that Allah is the sole creator.
That's the consistent view presented here. Allah alone is the ultimate independent Khaliq and Razik. Miracles might happen at the hands of prophets or imams, but it's always by Allah's permission and power, not their own inherent independent ability to create or sustain. It really underscores that absolute divine sovereignty, doesn't it?
Even within a belief system that gives imam spiritual status to figures like the Al-Wahid, it provides a way to understand their role without compromising the absolute unity and agency of God. The source also briefly touches on other aspects like tawakkul, reliance on God, and dedicating actions solely to Him, just to show Tawheed is broad. But the core focus of this excerpt was definitely that Wahid Ahad distinction, and then the Kalk-Risk point.
Very much so. So to kind of wrap up what we've pulled from this source, this deep dive really took us beyond just God is one.
Definitely. We saw that crucial split, Wahid meaning numerically one, no other gods, but then the deeper concept, Ahad, one, single, indivisible essence, no parts. And we unpacked that philosophical argument tied to Ahad, the idea that parts have to come before the whole, which just doesn't work if God is the absolute beginning.
Right.
It creates that impossible paradox. A very powerful argument presented in the source.
And then we looked at creation and sustenance.
Right, Tawheed of Kalk and Risk. Even when prophets or imams seem to be acting, the source emphasizes that Allah is the sole independent creator and sustainer. Others are intermediaries, acting by His power. The Jesus example, the Imam Mustai letter, it all points back to Allah as the ultimate source of all action and existence. Understanding these specific points, Wahid versus Ahad, the view on Kalk and Risk, it really does give you a much richer, more nuanced picture of Tawheed as understood in the specific tradition. It moves you from just a statement to, well, wrestling with the implications of what that oneness truly means and its essence.
And it leaves you thinking, too. I mean, contemplating a being that exists entirely without parts. That's hard to wrap your head around, isn't it?
It really is. Everything we experience is composite.
Exactly.
So this idea challenges our basic understanding of what it even means to exist. And the source mentioned its next topic would be the attributes of Allah.
Ah, yes, sifatullah.
Which makes you wonder, if God has no parts, how do you even describe attributes? How do qualities or characteristics apply to something that isn't composed of anything? That feels like the next big conceptual hurdle.
It certainly does. How do you attribute things like knowledge or power or mercy to an essence that is fundamentally simple, non-composite? That's definitely something to mull over, building on what we've discussed today.